The first encounter. The barren winds swept through the ruined city, carrying with them the scent of dust and decay. Ethan moved cautiously through the rubble, his eyes scanning every shadow. It had been days since his last decent meal, and the supplies in his backpack were dwindling fast. This alien world had once been a bustling trade hub, but now it was nothing more than a graveyard, a stark reminder of humanity's fragility. He ducked under a crumbling archway and stepped into what had once been a grand plaza. Now it was a field of twisted metal and shattered glass. The faint glow of the setting sun cast long shadows across the debris. Ethan's boots crunched softly against the ground as he made his way toward the remains of a structure that might hold something useful. That's when he saw her. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light. A figure sat slumped against a fallen column, half hidden by the rubble. His pulse quickened as he approached, his hand instinctively going to the knife at his belt. He had learned the hard way that nothing in this world could be trusted, not even someone who looked vulnerable. But as he drew closer, his caution gave way to something else entirely. The figure was a woman, though unlike any woman Ethan had ever seen. Her skin was a pale, shimmering blue, and her long silver hair cascaded over her shoulders like liquid light. Her violet eyes, half-lidded with exhaustion, flickered toward him, filled with a mixture of fear and despair. Ethan hesitated. She looked fragile, like a leaf ready to crumble in the wind. Her thin frame trembled, and her breaths were shallow. She didn't seem like a threat. In fact, she barely seemed alive. "Hey," he said softly, lowering his knife but keeping his distance. "Are you okay?" Her head tilted slightly, but she didn't respond. She just stared at him, her gaze wary yet pleading. Ethan's chest tightened. Whoever, or whatever, she was, she needed help. He reached into his pack and pulled out a ration bar. It wasn't much, but it was all he could offer. He held it out toward her, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. "Here, take it." She flinched at first, her body stiffening as if she expected a blow. But as the seconds passed, the hunger in her eyes won out. Trembling, she reached for the bar, her fingers brushing against his. Ethan felt a shiver run up his arm, not from fear, but from the sheer coldness of her touch. She tore into the food with a desperation that made Ethan's heart ache. Tears rolled silently down her cheeks as she ate, her body shaking with each bite. It wasn't just hunger. It was something deeper. Despair. Loss. A loneliness Ethan knew all too well. He crouched down, keeping his voice gentle. "It's okay. You're safe now. I'm not going to hurt you." For a moment, she stopped eating and looked up at him. Her violet eyes glistened with unspoken gratitude. And though her lips didn't move, the emotion in her gaze said more than words ever could. Ethan felt his resolve harden. He didn't know who she was, or where she came from, but he wasn't about to leave her here to die. "My name's Ethan," he said, pointing to himself. "Ethan." She tilted her head again, as though trying to process his words. Then, with great effort, she raised a trembling hand and pointed at herself. Her lips moved, forming a sound too soft for him to hear. Ethan leaned closer, and she whispered it again. "Lyra." Her voice was weak, but it carried a quiet strength that sent a shiver through him. Ethan nodded, offering her a small smile. "Lyra. Okay, let's get you out of here." She didn't protest as he gently helped her to her feet. Her legs wobbled beneath her, and Ethan had to steady her with an arm around her waist. She was light, her body frail from starvation. He felt her lean into him, her trust tentative but real. As they made their way out of the plaza, the sun dipped below the horizon, bathing the world in shadows. Ethan scanned the surroundings, his senses on high alert. The wasteland was no place to linger after dark. But for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of hope. He wasn't alone anymore. Neither was she. Together, they would face whatever came next. And maybe, just maybe, they'd find a way to survive. Fragile trust. The night was silent, save for the distant rustle of wind weaving through the shattered city. Ethan guided Lyra through the maze of ruins, her unsteady steps forcing them to move at a cautious pace. Her hand clung to his arm, her grip weak but resolute. He could feel the chill of her touch even through his jacket, a constant reminder of how fragile she was. "We're almost there," Ethan said, his voice soft. He doubted she understood his words, but it felt better than the oppressive silence. She glanced at him, her violet eyes heavy with exhaustion, but carrying a flicker of trust. His shelter came into view, the collapsed building whose basement had miraculously remained intact. It wasn't much, but it was safe. Ethan led her inside, guiding her down the uneven steps. The air grew cooler as they descended, the faint scent of damp stone lingering in the space. Lyra paused in the doorway, her gaze darting around the room. The fire pit in the center flickered dimly, casting a warm glow on the walls. A makeshift bed lay in one corner, covered with a blanket that had seen better days. Supplies were neatly stacked on a rickety shelf, their scarcity evident. "It's not much, but it's home," Ethan said, motioning for her to sit. Lyra hesitated, her body tensed as if expecting danger. Ethan knelt beside her, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. "It's okay. You're safe here." She lowered herself onto the bed, her movements slow and cautious. Ethan grabbed the blanket and draped it over her shoulders. Her fingers gripped the edges, pulling it tight around her as if trying to shield herself from the world. Ethan busied himself with the fire, adding a few sticks to coax the flames to life. The light danced across the room, softening the harshness of their surroundings. He glanced over his shoulder, watching as Lyra leaned back against the wall, her head resting on the blanket. Her eyes closed briefly, and he could see her chest rise and fall with labored breaths. Reaching into his pack, Ethan pulled out a can of soup and a small pot. He filled it with water from his bottle and set it over the fire. As the water began to heat, the soft aroma of the meal filled the air. He couldn't help but notice the way Lyra's nose twitched, her eyes fluttering open as the scent reached her. Ethan grabbed a small tin cup, pouring some of the soup into it. He held it out to her, the steam curling between them. "Here. It's not fancy, but it's warm." Lyra stared at the cup, her expression unreadable. Slowly, she reached out, her fingers brushing against his as she took it. Her hands trembled slightly, but she held on, lifting the cup to her lips. She sipped cautiously, her eyes widening as the warmth spread through her. "You like it?" Ethan asked, smiling faintly. She didn't answer, but the way her body relaxed told him enough. He watched as she drank, her movements becoming steadier with each sip. For a while, they sat in silence, the crackling fire filling the void between them. Ethan leaned back, his mind racing with questions. Who was she? Where had she come from? What had left her in such a broken state? Lyra set the empty cup down, her gaze drifting to the fire. Her fingers played with the edge of the blanket, and for a moment, Ethan thought she might speak. Instead, she reached into a small pouch strapped to her waist. She pulled out a small glowing crystal, its light faint but steady. Ethan's eyes widened. "What's that?" She hesitated, then held it out toward him. Ethan took it carefully, the warmth of the crystal surprising against his palm. Its light pulsed gently, almost like a heartbeat. He looked up at Lyra, who watched him intently, her expression a mixture of hope and apprehension. "It's important, isn't it?" Ethan asked. "Something you're trying to protect?" Lyra nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. She reached for the crystal, and Ethan handed it back without hesitation. Her fingers closed around it, and she held it close to her chest, her eyes shimmering with emotion. "You've lost so much, haven't you?" Ethan murmured. He didn't expect an answer, but her silent tears spoke volumes. As the fire burned low, Ethan felt a pang of determination. He didn't know what the crystal meant or why it mattered so much to her, but he knew one thing. He wouldn't let her face this alone. "You're safe with me," he said quietly. "Whatever it takes, I'll help you." Lyra looked up at him, Her violet eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and vulnerability. She didn't speak, but her faint smile was all the answer he needed. For the first time in years, Ethan felt something stir in his chest, a sense of purpose, fragile but growing. They were two lost souls in a broken world, but together, they just might find a way to survive. Shared burdens. The sun rose slowly over the wasteland, its light seeping through the cracks in the shelter's walls. Ethan stirred first, his muscles stiff from sleeping on the hard floor. He glanced over at Lyra, who remained curled under the blanket. Her breathing was steady now, her face no longer as haunted as it had been the night before. Quietly, Ethan stood and prepared for the day. He grabbed his knife, his pack, and the last of his food rations. They would need more supplies soon. The world outside the shelter was harsh and unpredictable, but it was a risk he had to take. Lyra was counting on him now. He knelt by her side, gently touching her shoulder. "Lyra," he said softly, hoping the sound of her name would wake her without startling her. Her violet eyes fluttered open, and for a moment she stared at him in confusion. Then recognition dawned, and her lips curved into a faint, grateful smile. "Good morning," Ethan said, motioning toward the small pile of food he prepared. "You need to eat." Lyra sat up slowly, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. She took the dried meat and fruit he offered, eating with the same cautious, deliberate movements as before. Ethan watched her, noticing how much stronger she seemed compared to the first night. Her trembling had lessened, and there was a flicker of determination in her gaze. "We'll need to move soon," he said, gesturing toward the world outside. "This place isn't safe for long." Lyra didn't respond, but she nodded, her expression serious. She seemed to understand more than he expected, her sharp mind picking up on his gestures and tone. Ethan had no idea what she'd been through, but it was clear she wasn't just a victim. She had survived something unimaginable. After they ate, they set out into the ruins. Lyra walked beside him, her steps still unsteady but stronger than before. She carried the glowing crystal close to her chest, its light faint but steady. Ethan's curiosity about it burned, but he didn't push her for answers. He sensed it was deeply important to her, perhaps even the key to her survival. As they moved through the broken streets, the eerie silence was broken only by the crunch of their footsteps. Ethan scanned their surroundings constantly, his knife ready at his side. The Westland was full of threats: raiders, wild beasts, and worse. He couldn't afford to let his guard down, not with Lyra depending on him. They reached the remains of an old supply depot by midday. Ethan signaled for Lyra to stay back as he approached cautiously, his knife drawn. The building was partially collapsed, but it looked untouched, the perfect place to scavenge. Inside, Ethan found a stash of canned food, water filters, and a few tools. His heart leaped with relief. It wasn't much, but it would buy them more time. As he packed the supplies into his bag, he heard a faint sound behind him. Footsteps. Spinning around, Ethan raised his knife, ready to defend himself. Lyra stood in the doorway, her eyes wide with fear. Behind her, 3 raiders emerged from the shadows, their weapons glinting in the dim light. "Looks like we got ourselves a scavenger and his pet alien," one of them sneered. He stepped forward, his crude weapon aimed at Ethan's chest. "Hand over the bag, and we'll let you live." Ethan's grip tightened on his knife. He knew their type: merciless and opportunistic. Giving them the supplies wouldn't guarantee their safety, but refusing would almost certainly lead to violence. Before Ethan could respond, Lyra stepped forward. Her hands glowed faintly, the same soft light as the crystal she carried. The raiders hesitated, their confident sneers replaced with uncertainty. "What the hell is that?" one of them muttered, taking a step back. Lyra raised her hands, the light intensifying. Ethan felt the air around them shift, charged with an unfamiliar energy. The raiders turned to run, but it was too late. A pulse of energy erupted from Lyra's hands, sending them sprawling to the ground. They groaned in pain, their weapons clattering uselessly beside them. Ethan stared in awe as Lyra's glow faded. She swayed, her strength clearly drained by the effort. He rushed to her side, catching her before she could fall. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Lyra nodded weakly, her eyes meeting his. "Safe," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan helped her outside, his heart pounding. Whatever Lyra had just done, it had saved their lives. But it had also raised more questions. How had she learned to wield such power? And why was she so determined to protect the crystal? Back at the shelter, Ethan laid Lyra down gently and covered her with the blanket. He watched her sleep, his mind racing. She wasn't just some lost traveler. She was something far more extraordinary. And for the first time, he realized that keeping her safe wasn't just about survival. It was about something bigger. He glanced at the crystal, its soft glow casting faint patterns on the wall. Whatever secrets Lyra carried, Ethan was determined to protect them. Together, they were stronger than the world that sought to break them. And as he settled in for the night, a sense of purpose filled him, one he hadn't felt in years. A glimpse of strength. The morning sun filtered through the cracks in the shelter's walls, casting soft golden light on Lyra's sleeping form. Ethan sat nearby, sharpening his knife with slow, deliberate strokes. His mind replayed the events of the previous day, the raiders, Lyra's unexpected power, and the strange energy that had surged through the air. He glanced at her, still clutching the glowing crystal even in sleep. It pulsed faintly, as though connected to her in some way Ethan didn't yet understand. She had saved them both with that power, but the toll it had taken on her was clear. Whatever she was protecting, it meant everything to her. When Lyra stirred, her violet eyes fluttering open, Ethan set his knife aside and knelt beside her. "How are you feeling?" he asked softly, his tone laced with concern. Lyra blinked at him, her gaze steady but tired. "Better," she said, her voice still faint, but more assured than before. Ethan nodded, relief washing over him. "Good. You scared me back there." He hesitated, then added, "That power, what is it?" Lyra looked down at the crystal in her hands, her expression growing somber. She took a moment to gather her thoughts, then pointed to the crystal and spoke a single word. "Home." Ethan frowned. "Home. Is that where you're trying to go?" Lyra nodded slowly, then gestured to herself, the crystal, and the world around them. Her expression told him what words couldn't. Her ship was gone, her people were gone, and the crystal was all she had left of her home. Ethan's chest tightened. He couldn't imagine losing everything, being stranded on a foreign world with no one to turn to. But Lyra had survived, holding onto this small fragment of her world as if it were her lifeline. "You're not alone anymore," Ethan said firmly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Whatever this crystal is, I'll help you protect it. We'll figure out how to get you home." Lyra's eyes shimmered with gratitude. For a moment, it felt as though the weight she carried had eased, even if only slightly. They spent the day moving cautiously through the ruins, scavenging for supplies and avoiding potential threats. Ethan watched Lyra closely, noting how she moved with a quiet grace despite her lingering weakness. Her senses were sharp, and her awareness of their surroundings often outpaced his own. She was a survivor, just like him. As they reached the edge of the city, Ethan spotted a structure that appeared mostly intact. It was an old communication hub, its antenna still jutting into the sky like a skeletal hand. He motioned for Lyra to follow him, his curiosity piqued. If there was any chance of sending a signal, or even learning more about her crystal, it would be here. Inside, the building was a maze of broken consoles and dusty screens. Ethan wiped off a terminal and fiddled with the controls, hoping to coax some life into the ancient machinery. Lyra stood beside him, her expression cautious but curious. After several minutes of work, the screen flickered to life, displaying lines of alien text Ethan couldn't decipher. Lyra stepped forward, her fingers brushing the controls. She closed her eyes, and the crystal in her hand began to glow brighter. The text on the screen shifted, transforming into a map of the surrounding area. Ethan stared in amazement. "How are you doing this?" Lyra didn't answer. Her focus was absolute as she manipulated the controls with surprising precision. The map zoomed out, revealing a network of glowing dots. One of them pulsed in rhythm with the crystal in her hand. "That's your ship," Ethan guessed, pointing to the pulsing dot. Lyra nodded, her eyes meeting his. "Broken," she said, her voice heavy with sorrow. "But power." Ethan understood. If they could reach the ship, they might find a way to restore it, or at least uncover more about the crystal and the energy it contained. But the journey wouldn't be easy. The dot was far beyond the city, in an area Ethan knew to be treacherous. "We'll go," he said, his tone resolute. "We'll find your ship and figure out how to fix it, together." Lyra placed a hand over his, her touch still cold but steady. "Together," she echoed, her voice soft but filled with determination. As they left the communication hub, the sky darkened with approaching storm clouds. The air grew heavy, and Ethan tightened his grip on his pack. The journey ahead would test them both, but he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Lyra wasn't just a stranger to him anymore. She was his partner, someone he was willing to fight for. They walked side by side through the ruins, the crystal's glow lighting their path as the storm began to rumble in the distance. Ethan glanced at Lyra, her silver hair catching the faint light, and felt an unexpected warmth in his chest. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. Together, they were stronger than the broken world around them, and whatever challenges lay ahead, Ethan knew they would face them as one. A new beginning. The storm broke over the city, rain cascading through the ruins as thunder rumbled in the distance. Ethan and Lyra pressed on, their bodies drenched and weary. The crystal in Lyra's hands glowed faintly, its light their only guide as night fell. Ethan glanced at Lyra, her face pale but determined. "You holding up?" he asked, raising his voice over the storm. Lyra nodded, though her exhaustion was evident. "Yes," she replied, her voice steady despite her trembling frame. Ahead of them, the map's coordinates led to a jagged ridge on the outskirts of the city. As they climbed, the storm began to ease, and the clouds parted to reveal a sky full of stars. Ethan paused, catching his breath as he looked up at the unfamiliar constellations. "Is your home out there?" he asked, pointing to the sky. Lyra followed his gaze, her violet eyes filled with longing. "Far," she said, her voice tinged with sadness. She looked down at the crystal, its glow reflecting in her eyes. "But here now." Ethan's chest tightened at her words. He understood what she meant. Her past was out of reach, but the present still held possibilities. He stepped closer, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Then we'll make this your home until we figure out how to get you back." Lyra's lips curved into a faint smile. "Together," she said softly, the word carrying a weight of trust and gratitude. At the top of the ridge, they found it. The remnants of Lyra's ship. The once majestic vessel lay half buried in the ground, its sleek surface marred by scorch marks and jagged tears. The sight of it made Lyra stop, her breath catching in her throat. She stepped forward slowly, her fingers trailing over the wreckage as if reacquainting herself with an old friend. "This is it?" Ethan asked, scanning the area for any signs of danger. The ship was massive, its shattered hull hinting at the advanced technology it once housed. Lyra nodded, her expression a mixture of hope and sorrow. She knelt by a panel, pressing her hand against its surface. The crystal in her palm pulsed brighter, and a soft hum emanated from the ship. Lights flickered to life, casting an eerie glow across the wreckage. Ethan watched in awe as Lyra worked, her movements confident despite her weariness. She accessed a console, the alien symbols shifting and rearranging themselves as she interfaced with the ship's systems. The air around them grew charged, and Ethan could feel the faint vibration beneath his feet. "What's happening?" he asked, stepping closer. Lyra glanced at him, her eyes shimmering with determination. Power, she said simply. Need to fix. Ethan nodded, kneeling beside her. Tell me what to do. I'll help. Lyra hesitated, then handed him a tool from the console. She pointed to a section of the ship, gesturing for him to repair a damaged connection. Ethan worked quickly, following her instructions as best he could. Together, they managed to stabilize the ship's core systems, though the damage was too extensive for a full repair. As the last connection was secured, the ship emitted a low, melodic tone. Lyra placed the crystal into a compartment on the console, and the glow spread throughout the ship. It wasn't fully operational, but it was alive again, a small victory in their uphill battle. When the work was done, Lyra sank to the ground, her energy spent. Ethan sat beside her, his own exhaustion finally catching up to him. They stared at the ship, its lights flickering softly in the darkness. I don't know if we can fix it completely, Ethan admitted, his voice quiet. But we'll keep trying. We'll find a way. Lyra turned to him, her expression softer than he'd ever seen it. She reached out, her fingers brushing against his hand. Ethan, thank you. Her words were simple, but they carried a depth of emotion that left Ethan momentarily speechless. He looked at her, the intensity of her gaze grounding him in a way he hadn't felt in years. You don't have to thank me, he said finally, his voice steady. We're in this together. Lyra's lips curved into a true smile this time, small but genuine. The barriers between them had faded, replaced by an unspoken bond that went beyond words. The storm had passed, and the stars above them shone brighter than ever. Ethan leaned back against the ship, feeling a rare sense of peace. Whatever lay ahead, he knew they would face it side by side. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. And neither did she. Their journey was just beginning, but together, they had found something worth fighting for, each other.